welcome to Marxist Voice, the YouTube channel and podcast for Socialist Appeal, the Marxist voice of labour and youth. My name is Adam Booth, and I am the editor of Socialist.net, the website of Socialist Appeal, and I'm going to be speaking tonight about the real crisis that's going on in Britain surrounding the coronavirus, the pandemic, and we'll be taking questions tonight as well. This is a live broadcast from quarantine, from self-isolation, so please write in on the YouTube channel if you've got any questions or comments. But yeah, just to say really about this crisis, I think it's really quite astonishing what you're seeing, in that, normally in a time of crisis like this, you'd expect a government to show some sort of reassurance, to give some sort of decisive action. People's lives have been fundamentally transformed. I mean, Harold Wilson, I think it was, said that a week is a long time in politics. And, the last 7 days, people's lives have been completely upended in a way that I don't think we've seen since the Second World War. And a lot of people have used this analogy of war, the fact that, that suddenly there's shortages of basic things, there's panic buying in the shops, there's a real feeling of our lives being transformed, being changed, there's uncertainty, there's fear, anxiety, and all of that really, it does create this feeling that there's a war going on, a war against this invisible enemy of this disease, COVID-19, and people are wondering, where's this going to end? And I think it's very instructive to look at the comments actually of Neil Ferguson, a professor at Imperial College London, who's on the kind of advisory team researching into this disease, providing advice to the government. And he said earlier this week that the idea of having a vaguely normal society is long gone, really, and that he says any idea of having a vaguely normal society is uncharted territory. We may well end up in a really quite different world for at least a year or more. And I think this is quite telling, and people are looking for some sort of guidance in this. And where has the government been? That's the question. Boris Johnson appears to be playing the part of a clown, of a court jester. He goes and veers from making these kind of callous remarks about how people should just prepare to have their loved ones lost, to, the next minute making jokes. I mean, there's a ventilator crisis. We desperately need ventilators for people who are going to have breathing difficulties with this disease. The market can't provide it. And something, needs to be done about this. So Boris Johnson goes to the bosses, goes to the CEOs. First mistake, the market's not going to provide these things. We need to nationalise, we need to plan. And he says to the CEOs, you need to step in and help build these things. We'll call it Operation Last Gasp. I mean, what kind of man thinks of making jokes like that in this situation? But it just shows the whole attitude of the government. It's been complacent, it's been cavalier. Boris Johnson in particular, this is a man, obviously he's been through Eton and Oxbridge, and his whole attitude has been one spoon-fed, this entitlement. And with that comes this incredible hubris, this incredible arrogance, this feeling that, everything can just kind of be taken in its stride. There's no need to plan, there's no need to worry about these things. It just shows the contempt, the disdain that people like Boris Johnson, these representatives of the ruling class, and reflecting the attitude of the ruling class, particularly the British capitalists, this short-term, callous, cold, arrogant attitude, it shows the attitude of these people. They think that, they can just roll up their sleeves and, British imperialism is we're made of harder stuff. We'll get through this. But it's nonsense. It goes against all scientific advice. You had months to prepare for this. We saw what happened in China. We saw what happened in Iran. We saw what happened in Italy. We could have foreseen what was coming. We should have foreseen what was coming. And obviously, it's an exponential disease. It exponentially spreads, and therefore things suddenly change. And we could have seen that coming. We could have seen and prepared for these things. But instead, the government went in with this complacency, with this complete kind of aloof, arrogant attitude, where initially they were suggesting, well, don't worry, Boris Johnson said, just take it on the chin. We'll get through this. Some people will die, but in the long run, we'll develop herd immunity, and then everything will be okay. But this was all based on completely flawed assumptions. And in fact, everyone has been warning against this. I'll just find some of the articles showing this. You've got Boris Johnson here talking to the press. The Guardian saying he'll be forever defined by this coronavirus crisis, and that's very true. He very clearly will be. And then you've got people saying quite openly that this was a disaster from beginning to end. Here we are. The Washington Post obviously takes someone writing on the other side of the Atlantic to see the truth. The British government's response to the coronavirus has been a disaster. You've got Anthony Costello here on Twitter. He's the, if I can load him up, he's the ex-head of the WHO, and his tweets are just endless kind of criticisms of the government, just saying, why weren't we prepared for this? Why didn't we look at what happened in China, and all these sorts of things. And yeah, it's just astounding that these people did not learn anything from this. And then now, to top it all off, we've been told that all of this idea of herd immunity, this strategy of the governments, was completely based on false assumptions, basically. All scientific models are based on assumptions. There's no perfect scientific model. Now, I'm very lucky, actually. I live with, believe it or not, an epidemiologist, someone whose job it is to study the spread of disease. He knows the one of the government advisors on this question. And he pointed me towards this scientific paper that's come out recently. And it was earlier this week, basically, a paper by some academics at Imperial College. You can see it here if you want to find it. Came out on Monday. And this fundamentally changed the government's strategy, basically. Previously, they were basically on this kind of do-nothing strategy here. And the idea was that actually this wouldn't spread that fast, it wouldn't mean too much, and that basically what we would have is some deaths, yes, a few thousand maybe, but collateral damage, if you like. Basically what the government thought was they've got a cost-benefit analysis. They can either shut down the economy, damage the profits of big business, and obviously for a Tory government that is anathema. So instead, we might as well sacrifice a few lives here and there, and we might get away with it. We'll get the herd immunity, we'll come out of it. Some old people will die. Well, they're a drain on the NHS anyway, aren't they? They're a drain on social care. But instead, then, what you had was that, basically, the models were wrong. And this is what this paper from Imperial is showing you, that those graphs there that you can see, this is the do nothing line basically predicts 500,000 deaths. And even the second line down, which is to do some preventative measures, they were predicting that with the government strategy as it was earlier this week, there would have been almost 250,000 estimated deaths. Why? Well, they underestimated the mortality rate. Basically, they thought everyone who catches the disease would be put in some nice intensive care unit and would get decent treatment, and the mortality rate would be relatively low. But in fact, what you've got is in fact that intensive care units are going to be saturated within weeks, if not days. And after that, people are not going to get the care they need. And instead, they're going to receive little to no care. Doctors are going to have to decide who lives and who dies, who gets a ventilator, who doesn't. The government, again, not preparing for this by trying to build more hospitals. Like in China, they built one in days. They could have requisitioned hotels and halls and, other facilities. What about private beds? We're renting them out at £2 million a day from the private sector, when we should just be requisitioning these things and expropriating private healthcare, putting it into the NHS where it belongs. Could have been doing all these things, but instead we haven't. And so the mortality rate they saw from Italy, it shoots up in this scenario, and you're estimating 300,000 potentially dead. And that's why you saw earlier this week this sudden change in strategy. And you could say, well, look, the scientists got it wrong, the experts got it wrong. But the fact is that, every model, as I say, has its flaws. The government saw what it wanted to see. It heard what it wanted to hear. It saw that, a few people might die. We'd get out of this, we'd have the herd immunity, and we don't have to shut down the economy. But instead, all the officials, the WHO were saying test, 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 and the government wasn't testing anyone. They were saying, isolate people, track down the disease, quarantine those affected, as they did in China, shut this down. And now only belatedly are we taking on that advice. But even there, the government has been dragging its heels. It's continually behind the curve. Again, not wanting to damage the profits of big business, not wanting to affect the bosses and the profits and the economy. And so only belatedly do they suddenly say, okay, people need to keep their distance, we need to shut down bars and clubs and restaurants and all these things. But instead of ordering that to be done, and ordering the closure of schools, and preparing people that this was going to take place, preparing businesses for the loss of business, they just advised it to people. And so it creates scare, it creates panic, it creates uncertainty. Most importantly, for the insurance side of things, these small businesses, this hospitality sector, they could have prepared for these things, and if it had been an official order, they could have claimed compensation from the insurance companies. But that wasn't done, probably precisely from Boris's point of view, to save the insurance companies. Doesn't want big insurance firms having to pay out lots of money. Much better to let these small businesses just go under, and let ordinary workers in these industries pick up the bill, and let the small business owners pick up the bill. And so again, bailing out the financial sector in favour of giving support to ordinary people, making ordinary people, workers and small business owners, pay for this. So now suddenly you've got this massive shutdown in the hospitality sector. A third, Unite the Union estimates, a third of hospitality and entertainment jobs could go out of quite a sizable industry. And that's only the beginning. Then you've got the airline industry that's going to have to be bailed out. They're talking about by the end of May, all of these airline companies could be falling out the sky, almost quite literally. And on top of that, there's the high street crisis. We've written about Dixon's and all these other brands that were already struggling, reliant on cheap credit. Suddenly they're going to get a credit crunch, and they're announcing thousands of job closures on top of all the economic crisis on the high streets in recent years. And so that's why the government has suddenly had to come in and intervene. And suddenly this Tory government, which has been talking about austerity, talking about the need to balance the budget, suddenly having to throw all that out of the water. Suddenly the money's there, when it comes to the threat to big business. And also probably the pressure from below. Labour's been pushing on this. Corbyn's been coming out saying, we need to guarantee people that their rent can be paid, that they're guaranteed the proper sick pay, proper full pay for anyone who has to work from home, or from anyone who's made unemployed by this. In other words, there's going to have to be a massive ramping up of the welfare state. Some people talking about universal basic income. Even Tories are talking about this, let alone Rebecca Long Bailey. So you're seeing, actually, one Tory minister even said, I'm willing to see this government become Jeremy Corbyn's Labour for as long as it takes to save the economy. Why? Because now they're predicting a 15% fall in GDP just in the next few months. And that's why Rishi Sunak, the new Chancellor, who probably wish he had never taken that job from Sajid Javid, now he's suddenly having to abandon this budget that, you know, the ink was barely dry on and is already hopelessly out of date. You know, he was promising 12 billion to address this crisis. Now, in his latest announcement earlier this week, promising 330 billion, precisely 15% of GDP, having to make up for that fall. But that's the amount of fall we're going to see just in the next few months alone. So, you know, there's going to have to be more money pumped into the economy, and more and more and more. And meanwhile, they're talking about a world slump of depression, you know, and even the markets are responding, where the big all these big investors who've been parking their money in government bonds, buying up government debt, now they're trying to flood out of that market because they want liquidity, they want cash. They don't trust governments anymore. Now there's billions or trillions in the case of the EU and the US pumping this money into the economy, this massive Keynesian package to keep things going, but it's to no end. It's like pushing on a piece of rope, you know. There's the whole economy's shutting down. What's needed is not just these Keynesian economic demands. What's needed is clearly nationalisation, is actually to plan the economy, to, you know, take control of the supermarkets, the healthcare producers and providers, and actually start planning society, you know, in you know, like a war. That's what was done in wartime, was to actually plan the economy and take control of these things. You know, this is why we say, really, socialist demands are the only ones that can make sense in this period. You know, we've got to take control of the economy and actually begin planning it, and actually get a grip on the situation, which the Tory government is not. It's just jumping from one disaster to another. Now they're suddenly saying they're going to close down the schools, but without, again, putting any provisions in place. And soon we're going to be seeing entire lockdowns across the country, a la in what happened in Italy, and is what is starting to take place in Spain and France and elsewhere. Life is going to fundamentally change for people in this coming period. And I think that's what we need to start getting our heads around. And this is what this paper from Imperial is trying to say, that actually you see them talking about later on. If I get you to the conclusions, they say that basically the only viable strategy is suppression, which is what the government is claiming they're doing now, and basically that the only real hope we've got now is to get a vaccine. But they're saying that that could take months, years even. You know, they're talking about reasonable suggestions being 12 to 18 months, I think, is the estimate given by this Imperial paper. If we can find it near the top. Here we are. The major challenge of suppression is that it will need to be maintained until a vaccine becomes available, potentially 18 months or more. In the meantime, transmission will quickly rebound if interventions are relaxed. In other words, what you're seeing here is that basically the whole of society is going to be in this phase where for a year or more, basically the only solution, as I say, is a vaccine. And in the meantime, there'll be these shutdowns, these lockdowns. Transmission will occasionally drop, the cases will drop, but the pressure on the NHS will stay there, the pressure on doctors and so forth. And, in the long run, the only way to solve it is a vaccine. But until then, every time they take away these suppression and this lockdown measures, the virus is just going to break out again. That's what they're predicting is going to happen in China, which is coming out of its lockdown. And so this is going to be a long process, a very drawn-out process, and one in which people's lives are going to be turned upside down. And I think in that sense, people are going to draw very revolutionary conclusions, because with these sharp changes and sudden changes in conditions come sudden and sharp changes in consciousness. As Marx said, it's conditions that create consciousness, and it's the change rapidly from one set of conditions to another, sudden plunging into poverty, into uncertainty, into desperation, that causes people on a mass scale to draw radical conclusions. We're already seeing it taking place, even here in Britain. People sending in reports to us at Socialist Appeal about the dramatic changes taking place in workplaces. People who've never talked about politics suddenly getting organised, looking for radical ideas, getting in touch with organisations like ours, Socialist Appeal, looking for what we've got to offer, Marxist ideas. Because fundamentally, that's the only thing that can offer a way out of this crisis, is a complete root and branch transformation of society along socialist lines. Capitalism has fundamentally failed. The market has broken down. We're in a deep slump, a depression, and there's no way out of that within the profit system. We've got to start planning according to need and get rid of the profit motive altogether. That's the only way forward for society, and that's what socialism is about. It's about offering a different world based on need rather than profit. That's what we're fighting for at Socialist Appeal. And therefore, I'll just appeal to those of you who are interested in what we've been producing online, what we have to say in our paper, in our material, in our video channels, in our podcasts. Please do all the things that are said just here, if you can see. Boop, boop, boop. Follow us on Facebook and YouTube, on Twitter. Subscribe to the podcast. You can get it on SoundCloud, on iTunes. It's called Marxist Voice. And do mainly these things here at the bottom, which is to get onto socialist.net and donate to us. We need your help in this difficult period. We've got staff, we've got offices, we've got campaigns. We've got to maintain all of these things, and we rely not on big business backers, not on any big philanthropic donors, but on ordinary people to fund the work that we do. You can help also by subscribing to our paper. We're not producing it anymore in physical formats. We're just sending it out as a PDF. But subscribe with a Solidarity subscription online, and you can help support the work that we do with the material that goes here on the YouTube channel, on the podcast, and of course online as well. And most of all, do that first one. Join us in the fight for revolution, because that really is the only way forward for humanity. Thank you. I'll see you next time.